out right now. Or do I just stick it right in my, I gotta put it right in my kisser. Okay, there we go. All right, so in front of you, there's also a little survey. So just as we go through the talk, as we go through the evening, before you leave, just make sure you fill it out, because we really appreciate that feedback. We want to get your feedback on our speakers, and so we can make sure we're bringing in good speakers. We're pretty sure Father's going to be a good speaker, but we want your feedback on that. So just keep that in mind. Just by the end, fill that out, and then we'll get started in a second. Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Thomas. I'm Ashley Jeunesse, the director of the Centre. It's my great pleasure this evening to introduce the Reverend Robert A. Sirico, Father Sirico, the founder of the Acton Institute, co-founder of the Acton Institute, and current president of that fine institute. He's also an active parish priest and frequent contributor to news, journals, and other media. Very well known, author of many articles, and a book that we are going to sign earlier today. The subject of the talk is the moral case for a free economy, and Father Sirico tells us that he will draw on his own life experience in amplifying that. So all I can say is anything could happen in the next half hour.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So I understand that I have another speech that I'm competing with tonight, so we won't mention that one. I have. Let me not go that. I'm not even going to go in that direction. So. I just want to say that I'm really delighted to be here, and not just because we had sub-zero temperatures in Rapids this last week, but the Center for Free Enterprise is a great place, and I'm delighted and indeed honored to be associated with it. This is a lecture on economics, but I wager to say that it will be the most unusual lecture that you've ever had on economics. Well, first of all, a priest is speaking to you about economics, and what could be odder than that? I was delivering a paper once at an organization of economists, International Organization of Economists, and I was making some of the basic case, it wouldn't be the same paper as an academic paper, on the connection between theology and free markets. And during the Q&A period, a hand went up from the back, and I'm a member of the society, and he was a member of the society, and he was a Nobel laureate economist. I won't tell you who it was, although his picture is in the center. And he got up and he said, Father Sirico, we're delighted to have you as part of our association, but can't you just leave theology out of economics? Welcome to our discipline. Can't you just leave theology out of economics? And I said, Professor, I have high regard for the work that you've done and the contribution you've made to economics. I said, but as an economist, you must understand that your discipline emerged from my discipline. That the first economists, according to Joseph Schumpeter, in his thick book, History of Economic Analysis, second chapter, he said that it was the scholastic theologians who could be identified as the inventors of scientific economics. So I said, Professor, welcome to my discipline. And tonight, what I'd like to do for a little bit, and then I'm anxious to engage in conversation, is to speak to you from the way I approach the economic question. And that is from the point of view of the human person. What sense would economics make if it doesn't have to do with human beings? Human action. Economics is the discernment of value and the use of goods and resources for human betterment. And that's predicated on human beings making decisions and acting so as to alleviate their dis-ease. And so I want to, and being also a priest and a preacher, and not just an academician, which I'm not. I don't teach in an academic institution. Well, I guess the think tank that I'm the president of is an academic institution, but by that I don't mean I teach in a university setting. What I'd like to do is contextualize this so that you see that the abstract studies that you do in economics are secondary to what the core of economics is, which is about the human person. And in order to do that, I want to give you a little bit of how I came to these questions myself. And my life begins in Brooklyn, New York in the 1950s, where I grew up in a very multicultural experiment before it was mandated by anybody. It was just called my neighborhood. We had all kinds of people in the neighborhood. And I grew up in an apartment that I suppose was about the size of this space right here in the front of this room. And in this space, there was a bedroom that overlooked Coney Island Avenue, which was not near Coney Island. Coney Island was down 2 miles. And it was a bedroom, my parents' bedroom. I had a crib and then later a little cot in there. Before the invention of privacy, there was no door. There was a living room here. My sister slept on the couch. And my 2 brothers slept in this small bedroom, bunk beds, and it was a foul and festering place that I lived in. A little bathroom, and then a little bitty kitchen. You know, as I'm looking at this, I think the apartment was probably smaller than this space. Just a little bitty kitchen that had a window that looked out. And if you go on YouTube, we've recreated this whole scene with actors that the story I'm going to tell you, you can see it on YouTube, at the Acton Institute YouTube site. And across that window was another window and another apartment laid out just the inverse of ours, where lived Mr. and Mrs. Schneider. And I remember one spring day, Mrs. Schneider was rolling out some rugula. She was making rugula. This is an Eastern European pastry. It's succulent, delicious, if it's made properly. And she was rolling it out, and I was watching her, looking into her window as I was peering out my windowsill. And we were separated by an air shaft. It really was a roof access, so if you went out your window, you could go up onto the roof. And she was making this. She was mixing the cinnamon and the sugar and the flour and the walnuts in a bowl with raisins and stuff, and then putting them into crescents, and then putting them into this pale green Wedgwood oven. And as she slid one sheet into the oven, she began to make some more, and she did this. And as she did this, spring day, the sun was coming in, it was back and forth, and pretty soon, wafting across from her window to our window was this wonderful aroma of the cinnamon and the sugar and all the rest of it. She never looked at me once during this whole process, until she pulled out the last tray. And she placed that on the windowsill. And then she looked up into my eyes and she said, "You'll come, I'll give you to eat." So I scampered over my windowsill and held out my greedy little hands. And Mrs. Schneider took a napkin and placed them over my hands, and she proceeded to put the warm, luscious rugula into the napkin. And as she did this, I noticed running up her forearm were a series of blue tattooed numbers. And I had no idea what that meant. And frankly, I was much more interested in the rugula. So I took them into my apartment and immediately hid them behind the bread basket, because my parents raised no stupid children. From my siblings, I hid them. My mom was there, and she came in, and I said, "Mom, Mrs. Schneider made some rugula." She said, "Good, good." I said, "Why does Mrs. Schneider have numbers on her arm?" And my mother, who I think she maybe finished 6th grade, first generation Italian, gave me the most profound lesson in moral theology, anthropology, indeed economics, all at once, in the following way. She said to me, on Saturday mornings, you always watch the Cowboys and Indians on television. I said, yeah. And she said, you know when the Cowboys lasso the calf? And I said, yeah. She said, what do they do when they lasso the calf? I said, well, they lasso it, and they jump off their horse, and they tie it up. And she said, and then what do they do? I said, well, then they brand it. And she said, why do they brand it? I said, that's to tell all the other cowboys that this is my calf. I own this calf. She said, that's what some people did to Mr. and Mrs. Schneider and their family. And she said, that's why you have to be particularly respectful of Mr. Schneider, because Mr. Schneider was a little meshuggah. I thought it was an Italian word at the time. I didn't know that there was a difference between Italians and Jews for about 5 years, other than our kitchens, because in New York, it's just, you're all one thing there. And I have never forgotten that lesson. And it really has kind of colored the way I approach the world. And everything that I have studied since then. Now I can articulate this story in a moral vocabulary. I can even apply it to economics, which I'll draw out in due course. But the important thing is that set the lens for the rest of my life. Growing up in the 50s and then into the 60s, I saw various things happening in the world, or at least heard about them. Cuba and Red China, and then the Civil Rights Movement. I remember that very well because I remember thinking, why would anybody object to somebody going into a Woolworths? We don't do that here. And yet the images on television were quite vivid. And my family was a culturally Catholic family, not a strongly, I mean, culturally we were very Catholic, but not particularly devout, not particularly pious. I took a deep interest in things religious, and it was very different than the temperament of my family. We were working class, poor family, and I had an interest in ideas and aesthetics and things like that. So it's a little different. And over the years, to kind of bring this to a focus, I left the practice of my faith. I became involved in the 70s in the movements of the day. I was living in California by this time. And all the social change movements, I got to know Jane Fonda and Tom Hayden. Some of you may recall those names. Others of you might only think of Jane Fonda in terms of exercise videos. But I knew her when she was part of the Campaign for Economic Democracy, which I worked with. If there was a picket line, I was picketing. If there was a sit-in, I was sitting in for a variety of causes, not just civil rights, the end of the anti-war movement, the beginnings of the gay movement, the beginnings of the feminist movement. The farm workers were a very, very big thing there in California at the time, Chavez. And as I say, I was deeply involved. My job was being an activist, even if I had little other jobs to support my life. And I remember one day coming back from one of the demonstrations, and we were in an apartment in Hollywood, California. And it was a hot day, we were sitting down all over the place. And we're talking about the revolution. When the revolution comes, this is what the world is going to look like. And everybody had their say about what they were hoping. When the revolution comes, this is going to happen, or that's going to happen. And when my turn came, I said, you know, when the revolution comes, we'll all shop at Gucci's. And it was silence in this room. the smoke stood still. I won't tell you what kind of smoke it was. I did inhale. And a friend of mine was, in fact, I just had communications with her recently. She was a good friend of mine. She was a feminist. I called her my lesbitarian Trotskyite. She was a serious Trotskyite, a member of the Socialist Workers' Party. And the occasion I had, I was watching Trotsky on Netflix. I don't know if you've seen it. Terribly boring, just like Trotsky. But anyway, I said, what did I say that was wrong? She said, Gucci's? I said, well, it's a symbol. It's a symbol of the revolution we're working for is designed to enable people to have access to goods and quality service. She said, Gucci's? She said, that's so bourgeois. And she said, I don't think you're a socialist. She was right. I just didn't know it. Because I didn't understand what all of that meant. I was not a serious Marxist. I was not an orthodox Marxist. She was an orthodox Marxist. A lot of the people around me were. I wanted justice. But it was very unclear how justice, how could we create a world where people could prosper, where people could be free, where people could, have their lives and take the lead in determining what their values were in their lives. And it was sometime after that event that I met somebody who gave me a bunch of books to read. I began by having an argument with him because I saw some bumper stickers on the back of his car that I thought were too right-wing and free market and all of this stuff, and I said, that's all fascism. And he said, define fascism. And I didn't have a quick definition of what fascism was. He said, I think you're delightfully dumb. I'm going to educate you. And that took place by him bringing me books to read and having long arguments about economics. And among those books were Friedrich Hayek's The Road to Serfdom, and Ayn Rand's Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal, and Milton Friedman's Capitalism and Freedom, and Friedrich Bastiat's The Law. Notice that all these books are secular in their orientation. Here I am telling you that these books precipitated in me two conversions. The first conversion was a political conversion. 6 intense months of debate with this guy and reading, for the first time really seriously reading what the arguments were for peace. But then over a period of time, I began to ask myself other questions that were deeper than questions of economics, that were questions about the nature of human life, of the human person, which is why I began by saying that my approach to economics is anthropological. And it was in that phase of my reading and experience that I bumped back into my faith. I eventually would return to my faith. Now I'm in my mid to late 20s, and took a number of years. Then I went to seminary. Eventually, I talked to a priest who, I had explained my life to him fully, confession. I went to confession after 13 years. This is a funny experience because it was a Jesuit priest who still heard confessions. And when I said to him, I'd like to go to confession, he said, okay, well, I thought we were going out to dinner. I said, yeah, we'll go out to dinner after confession. He said, oh, okay. He said, go ahead. Unless we talk perhaps it's been 13 years since I had confession. He looked at his watch. But I recovered my faith, and then thanks to a spiritual director who I met, he prompted me to think about the priesthood because he knew my zeal, and so I did. And I went into seminary, and in seminary in the early 80s, I found the same kind of stuff that I had encountered and advocated streets of Hollywood in the 1970s. And so began this process of integration between economics and ethics, or free markets and theology and the like. So here's my approach to this. As I began to study theology and had some economic background, and then began to read more deeply in both camps, my approach to it is based, as I say, on the human person. And of course, the archetypal story that we find in the scriptures, which is at the base of the Judeo-Christian understanding of the world. And even if you don't take it literally, the Garden of Eden nonetheless is mythic in what it's saying about the world and our relationship to the transcendent. And what it says is that this vision of God, as contained in the scriptures, is a vision of a God who is not just detached from the world, but is the origin of the material world. And that he creates the material world and pronounces this material world, this physicality, good. So Genesis 1, you read all the days of creation, and each time God says, we saw what he made, we said it was good, it was good, it was good. And then he makes man. The image is of God making man from the earth, from the dust of the earth, and then breathing into him the breath of life. So that man himself is a composite of the material and the transcendent. And that is what the human person is. And then the first words of Scripture, this is now within the first 2 chapters of Genesis, is a vocation that God gives to man and woman to have stewardship over creation, to have responsibility for the creation. And somewhere in the DNA of the Judeo-Christian tradition, there is deeply buried this assumption that economics emerges from this condition of man and woman living in a scarce world and being called, or a world with scarce resources, and being called upon to steward that material world. That what they lived in the midst of was not a jungle, but a garden that needed care and pruning and tending. And that this begins the whole Judeo-Christian invention, if you will, of what will much later come to be known as economics. And you see this earthiness throughout the Old Testament and into the New Testament. This earthiness, this concern for the material, concern for property, concern for economic relationships, concern for contracts, concern for law, concern for human beings' dignity and certain rights. Now, this doesn't just pop into existence, codified and defined all at once, but there is this process that goes on throughout the Hebrew scriptures and then into the Christian scriptures of this physicality and the sanctity of the physicality of the world. This is what I suggest to you is the basis and why the basis of economics emerges out of the Judeo-Christian tradition. It's this respect for the human person and for all of those things that relate to the human person. Relationships of freedom, relationships of contract, relationships of property, and the vocation, the fundamental vocation of the human person to be a co-creator with God. Because God says, multiply, have dominion, have stewardship over the earth. And historically, when it begins to emerge in the philosophical disciplines, is an ethical concern for the use of property. And this is what Schumpeter was referring to in his book, History of Economic Analysis, when he kind of tags these scholastic theologians as the first economists, because they were dealing with questions of how can we live good lives? How can we live lives that are just, that are moral? And in the course of talking about that, of course, they would talk about a whole host of things. They would talk about marriage and sexuality and other things. But they would also talk about things like trade. What is trade and what makes trade just? What is our relationship with other people? How do we respect the right of property in other people? What is money and what is the use of money? You know, does anybody have a quarter? You may already know this. Anybody have a quarter or a dime? Have you ever noticed what's on the side of your quarter or your dime? You should carry one. Either one. Just see it on paper. For some reason, the nickel and the penny don't have it. You notice these little ridges? Do you know what they are? Does anybody know what the ridges are? Where the tradition comes from? It comes from the scholastics. Actually, the scholastics observed this. When the monarchs, the aristocrats, would get paid in silver or gold, and they'd collect a bunch of these things, what they would do is they would file the edges of the coin and then put it back in circulation. Now, if I filed the coin and I gave it back to you, you probably wouldn't notice just a little bit would be taken off. These ridges are a traditional remnant of that consciousness that politicians could inflate the currency by just taking a little bit off. And if you put the ridges on and somebody filed it off, you'd notice it had been tampered with. That comes out of the scholastics. Just as an example, you have a body of literature, particularly the School of Salamanca, where these guys were doing their moral theology and bumping into questions of economics because they were doing moral theology. Because in the theology that they were operating out of, the world was sacred. The contract was sacred. Keeping one's word was sacred. Recognizing property was sacred. The rule of law. All of these things began to have definition. Again, I want to emphasize, I'm not saying that this pops out of the Bible, plop, and you have all of this stuff. These are currents of thought, ways of thinking, phases of clarification and definition that take place over time. And this is why what you have in the Judeo-Christian culture is arguably the most sophisticated understanding of economics. Now, there were tendencies toward this in other cultures at various times. Thomas Stark's book on the history of freedom and authority, the name's just gone out of my head for a moment, really identifies other places where this has happened, but it really kind of comes together in the West in a way that really invents the systems of economics as we know it today. Now, what is so intriguing to me from that perspective, so I've given you this perspective of someone who begins in a very raw way of life, understanding human dignity, understanding that people cannot be owned by other people, understanding that when that happens, everything goes awry, and that most importantly, that recognition of human dignity is part and parcel of what society, or what a just society is. And somebody who came through what was an argument against systems of economic liberty, the attempt that I was engaged in at that time to weaken definitions and the security of private property. And then who came back to an understanding of these things, and now who has had the advantage over the years of being able to study these things in a theological vocabulary. But the argument over economics is inevitably not just an argument over utility, but an argument over morality. And I think this is why you see today, once again, these arguments. If you have ears to hear, you can hear the moral undertone of the argument. What is it that we're concerned with? We're concerned with the Mrs. Schneiders of today. Now, they come in different forms, but we're concerned, what, for the vulnerable, for the alienated, for the marginalized. And it's not enough that we just have good feelings toward those who are discriminated in one way or another. But we have to have good thoughts. And not just good thoughts, but to know how to build good institutions that can instantiate those thoughts, those ideas, building institutions and traditions that will provide for the opportunity for people to live lives free from the control of others, to the extent that that's possible, within the context of law. Law is that which guarantees our nature to flourish, provides the context for it. And politics has a role in all of this. But politics has to have a limited role in all of this because human beings are prior to politics. The natural institutions exist before politics. Politics exists, law exists, to ensure that these natural institutions can exist and flourish. And when we invert that, when we put politics first, when we put the state first, when we put bureaucracy first, very often in the name of morality, in the name of protecting human dignity and human freedom and all the rest of it, what ends up happening is the fulfillment of the prophecy of Lord Acton. Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And we're seeing it unfold before our very eyes. I mean, I remember a whole host of political battles that were fought, which I found myself on one side or the other on years ago. But you're seeing it today. Venezuela. Venezuela is the reincarnation of Cuba. And the same things that happened in Cuba are happening today in Venezuela. I'm particularly moved by Venezuela because I know a lot of Venezuelans. I've been to Venezuela, I've forgotten how many times. I've visited their prisons and talked to their politicians in prison. And just today, I'm getting, this is incredible, I'm getting video clips of friends of mine who are on the streets as it's all unfolding. It's nerve-wracking to watch, and it's exhilarating to watch at the same time. But the same things that happened in Cuba happened in the Soviet Union and in the satellites, happened in China, where socialism is taken seriously. These things happen. Now, why is that? I don't want to just put kind of ideological rhetoric to work here. I want to ask the question, why? If my assertion is that socialism doesn't work, why doesn't it work? And this insight I get, or at least the person who helped me to see it most clearly, was this book that I mentioned and a subsequent book that he wrote. Friedrich Hayek, the particular book that I'm referring to and the way of thinking, it comes out of the body of his work, but in particular, his book happens when you get to be 60, 70 years old, time to time. Fatal conceit. Fatal conceit. Think about that phrase. It's a beautifully poetic phrase. It's a conceit. It's an assumption. It's a presumption that the wisest minds can gather and direct the economic decisions of society as a whole. That's the fatal conceit. It's not necessarily insincere. I don't think that necessarily Chavez or Castro started out with the intention to inflict harm and great damage on people. It's the assumption, it's the conceit that is fatal. They let other people judge the intentions. But here's what happens. This gathering of wise heads that can direct cannot direct because they don't know. They presume to know what they cannot know. And in the economic realm, what is it that they cannot know? They cannot know your individual subjective choices for things. That's the basis of economic exchange. The price of the thing, this is just so illuminative to me when I discovered this. I thought the price of the thing is the number that the capitalist put on a product to sell. That's the price of the thing. Many people might think that. I hope in a classroom of economists or future economists that you know the fallacy of that. The price of the thing isn't determined by the capitalist. It's determined by the consumer. It's determined by the consumer because when I go to buy something, I know what I need that for. And if you're charging me above my need, then I don't buy it. And then there are enough of me that agree with that, the capitalist brings down his price. So the consumer determines the price, not only the price of the thing, but what you're going to produce in the first place. Even its color and its packaging. So that prices reflect a knowledge that the consumer has and communicates by buying the thing or not buying the thing. And the whole chain of economic production is predicated on that freedom of people to make those choices. That is to bring their subjective knowledge to the table of exchange. What socialism does, by its presumption that you can socially manage the economy, whether it's a Politburo or a Congress or whoever, whatever grouping, they create this group of people who make the decisions without the knowledge of what people really want. And what ends up happening is that the production engine either overproduces or underproduces. And when you obfuscate the real value of things and the knowledge that comes by free pricing, because every price is telling you something about people's values and the access that they have to the goods or to the raw product that's going to be produced, all of this. When you obfuscate that, you create stupidity. That is, you remove knowledge. You no longer have dependable knowledge to communicate back and forth. And that's why the case of Cuba, the case of Venezuela, the case of China, the case in Eastern Europe, and any place that takes this idea of managing the economy from the center, that is central planning, will cause this dislocation in society as a whole. Hayek's point in the Fatal Conceit, Mises's point before Hayek in 1921, was that socialism isn't bad economics, it's anti-economics. That it can't coordinate. It can coordinate for a time because it takes a while for all of this stuff to roll out or for you to see the effects of the thing. But ultimately, if you let it go long enough, it collapses of its own stupidity. And I'm saying that not just to call people stupid, but the system itself reduces the knowledge in society. You see, to quote John Paul II, this is a man who understood both anthropology and theology and ethics and economics and political systems. He put it so well, he said, man is man's greatest resource. That the human mind is the source of the creation of value in society, the source of productivity. It's the acknowledgement that wealth doesn't exist in a state of nature. Wealth doesn't exist because a given country has all these resources. If that were the case, then Africa would be rich and Japan would be poor. But it's the ability of the human mind to perceive the value or the use of the thing, the service of the thing, to the community as a whole. The classic example of this is oil, which was mostly an annoyance for human history, right? Until the combustion engine was invented. And what does that mean? It means that we were able to harvest energy and place that energy at the disposal of the community as a whole. And that's what transformed this black, sooty, sticky, annoying substance into black gold, human service. But it took the inventiveness of the human mind. So to draw out from nature raw material is not to be wealthy. It's to transform that into human service. And if this doesn't begin to give us a sense of the moral dimension of what economics is, then I don't know what would convince a person of this inevitable connection. In theology, particularly in my own tradition, there's this sense of the reverence of the material world. Not that we should be so attached to it we worship it, but a recognition that our engagement with the material world becomes an occasion for the encounter with the transcendent. A philosopher once said, Etienne Gilson, he said, if you want to build a cathedral that represents the rising of the soul to God, like the facade at Notre Dame, you must first understand geometry. Because in order to make such a beautiful cathedral, you have to make use of nature. You have to understand the rules and the laws of nature in order to build something that is a spiritual edifice. So this notion that we can ignore the laws of nature, the nature of the human person, including the principles and laws of economics, and get away with it, is a fraud, and it's a dangerous fraud. And so, let me just leave you with one more image to think about. And it comes from a monk who went into a monastery and wrote home to his father and said, Dad, I'm in the monastery now for X period of time, and we get up in the middle of the night and all the world is hushed to pray. I don't know if you've ever been in a monastery or if you've heard Gregorian chant, then you hear the form of prayer. It's a very beautiful and soothing and form of transcendent prayer. He said, we get up in the middle of the night to pray, but all the world is hushed. I'm so glad I'm away from the world to be able to do this. And his father wrote him back and said, son, your mother and I are so proud that you found your vocation in the monastery. But I want to remind you of one thing. Many a night, when all the world was hushed, your mother and I rose from our beds to change your dirty diapers. And in doing that, we found our vocation. And I often thought of that story as a metaphor for the way in which we must engage with the mess of the world in order to find out who we really are. And a lot of the mess of the world is found in enterprise. And the majority of people, I think, have a vocation to be creative, to be involved in the world of work. But how sad it would be if you think that business or the study of numbers, or dealing with computers and all the rest of it, is just utilitarian, there's a high and noble potential to your vocation. Not only because it serves other people who would go without otherwise, but because it enables you to become what you can be and what you want to be. So I hope you think about that as you continue your studies, to broaden and deepen the significance of what you're doing, and to bring this transcendent awareness to your enterprise. Thank you very much.
Well, man, thank you very much for stimulating thought. You reminded me of something which an economist once said, which has somehow got lost in this time, but your talk really does bring this to mind. That nobody but a fool would study economics just to know what determines the price of a refrigerator. There's way, way more to it than that, and you clearly understand that. So thank you very much for a wonderful talk. There is time for questions, and people will come among you with raw high whips to encourage.
First one here, then we'll do second. Put it right up to your mouth so that it'll pick it up.
Father, just curious, we have had Social Security for decades, since the 30s. We have had Medicare since the 60s. These are social programs. You could even use the word socialist. If you tried to remove those from people, they would be a revolution. So my opinion, or what I'm asking you is, what is your opinion of the latest of these drives for a one-payer system for health care? People now are saying they feel they have a right to health care, and I'm just wondering where you would stand on that.
Well, from just a strictly economic point of view, if they were to do that, that would accelerate the decline. I mean, we have an illusion that Medicare and Social Security are working because we're feeding it, not based on its own replenishment, but we're feeding it from outside that. If we accelerate that process and we can no longer feed it because there aren't enough people and there isn't enough money to go into the system to keep the illusion going, then I think that it'll accelerate the decline. Of course, it will extend it too, because the wake of that disaster would be horrific. Morally speaking, especially when people speak about the right to health care, which is different than the right to obtain health care, right? The right to health care implies that you have a right to the knowledge, the talents, the freedom, the priority of other people. I mean, we always think of it just in terms of what we get by demanding this right, but we don't think of it in terms of who's giving this to us. So it's the nurse and the doctor and the research people and all of the other factors that go into a healthcare system that provides for our well-being that we are making slaves of. And we know what socialist healthcare looks like, whether it's in Russia or even in Great Britain, which is one of the great systems. I lived in England and I saw the system, and personally, I remember arriving in England to go to university, and in the introductory days, they gave us the National Health Service card. I said, what is this? They said, well, this is your health service card. I said, what does this do? They said, well, if you get sick, you go, and you get taken care of free of charge? Yeah, free of charge. I said, if I had come down with cancer? Yeah, that's very amazingly generous of the British people, but I haven't paid a single farthing in taxes. And I had occasion, I had an infection in my eye, and I went to this, and there was a room about this size filled with people waiting for 3 or 4 people at public stations to examine you. And I thought, I'm out of here, you know, and I had, of course, as an American, I had private insurance, so I went to a doctor, lovely, would you like some tea? And, you know, it was all taken care of. It doesn't work because of the reasons that I said about socialism in general. It can't calculate. If you say it's all free, then people will take advantage of it. Because I mean, if I opened a butcher shop and had porterhouse over here and hamburger over here and everything in between and just said, there are no prices on this, just take what you want, everybody's over here. And that's exactly what happens in these systems. That people don't, you know, you have to be a highly ethical person to say, I'm not going to take something that I can't, you know, sustain. So these things are not sustainable. They're very dangerous. This now Medicaid for all, which is the other thing. It's like education. You know, you can have all your education debts paid. That's a nice thought. And of course you all want that. The problem is that the state is the great myth whereby everyone thinks they can live at everyone else's expense. And I wish I had written that line, but it comes from the box. Or as Margaret Thatcher said, socialism is just fine until you run out of other people's money. So I think this is what we're confronting. Now, what's the way out of that? That's more complicated. But the way out of that is economists who can, in communicable ways, in winsome ways, tell the story of human prosperity, of human well-being. Now, the way I choose to do it, because I'm a preacher, I've stolen a model from somebody who used to tell parables. And that's why if you go back over the tape of this, you're going to hear I've told you things that in a parabolic form and then given you the economic argument. And that's what you have to do. You have to communicate these ideas in ways that people understand, that their well-being depends upon their freedom and the freedom of other people to contribute their intelligence and their knowledge to this whole thing. So we're living in a very precarious moment now, because not only is there an abysmal ignorance of the economic way of thinking, as it's called, but people don't even think in general anymore. I mean, we were speaking a little bit earlier, it's depressing to me to see the lack of real disagreement in the public forum, on cable TV, on radio, on the internet. You say to me, oh, you know, there's lots of disagreement. No, there's not real disagreement. There's just name calling. Disagreement is when I make an assertion and you disagree with it for reasons that you give, and I counter those reasons with other facts and stuff that you give, and then we go back and forth on this thing. That's not happening generally in society. And that's very sad and very dangerous. So what we need are people like you who are going to take these ideas seriously, and not just for the sake of getting a degree, but for the sake of making an impact in our world, and an impact for the good.
Get it right up close.
I'll give you your quarterback.
Yeah, you did. I want you to keep it. I want you to keep it so you put in your other suit. Next time you'll have it. The Federal Reserve attempts to adjust interest rates to avoid inflation. Do you consider this sort of a central planning thing where they think they know more than more exists than just they know?
Of course, I think central banks in general do that. That's exactly what it is. I know how to deal with inflation. Stop printing money. Stop shaving the coins. That's inflation. I mean, generally. Now, thankfully, I think we're living in a moment, and this would be too complicated, not only for us to get into because it would take time, but also I'm no great expert on it, but I sure have an intuition. I think this may be solved by blockchain, by the ability to have ability to keep records that are accessible to everyone so that we know what's going on. And that if we have various forms of electronic currency, which interestingly enough, Milton Friedman had predicted years ago, that we can, of course, what's going to happen is, to the extent that this becomes effective, I'm talking about Bitcoin and other currencies. Bitcoin isn't the only kind of electronic currency. That central bankers will stop this, that they'll make laws to prevent it. I'm not sure how that will go because I think it's outside their reach. But I think that this would be a very positive thing for the future, to have some kind of blockchain and cryptocurrency that will be outside the reach of politicians. As long as politicians have a say over the money supply, that they're going to be pressured by people who want the porterhouse. And we'll do that until people understand this. I think, yeah, so I don't think we need a Federal Reserve. I remember when I heard Hayek speak in probably 1975 at UCLA, just when I was making this conversion, I was flabbergasted that he called for the privatization of the monetary system. I said, banks? Banks? I mean, that's what the Federal Reserve is supposed to be. Banks putting a brake upon government. But now what they become is a central bank in themselves. So, and I probably shouldn't even initiate a discussion because it's so much to be said about that. But it's magical thinking to think that some central government has to guarantee the stability of a currency when it's at the whim of politicians and political pressures. Whereas if people have money and have something of value that's stable and difficult to reproduce, which is either knowledge and blockchain or gold or something like that, then it's less manipulable. And so I think we need to move to something like that in order to avoid the kinds of things. You know, in Venezuela right now, this is astounding to think of. It's something like 1 to 10 million % inflation. I don't even know what that means. I can't even imagine. The only way people are living is the people who have money outside of
Okay, I think Mike.
I study economics and religion here, and Acts 2 tells us that the believers sold their own possessions and property to help those in need.
Right.
And later in chapter 4 says that they called nothing to good.
Right, they had all things come.
And how do I reconcile the things I'm reading in Scripture and the things I learned in the economics class?
Right. Well, let me start by saying that was not socialism.
Yeah, I agree.
And you know why it wasn't socialism?
Because they were getting it.
That's right. Churchill, there's a great line from Churchill that I just read, and I haven't committed it to memory. It's a very simple line, but it's something to the effect that Christianity says, what I have is yours. Socialism says, what you have is mine. And that's the difference. In fact, that experiment in the early church, because it was an intimate gathering of people, it was like a family. People knew and they shared. But it's very explicit, not just in Acts 2, but if you go to Acts 15, where there's the story of Ananias and Sapphira, who are part of this experiment. Ananias and Sapphira go, and they have a plot of land that they sell, and they sell it, and they hold back some of it and bring the money to the feet of Peter. And they say, here, we've sold the land. And Peter says, wait a minute. When you had the property, was it not your own? And after you sold the property, the money, was it not your own? But now you have lied by pretending to give it all. It was all your own. So this is not a model for the economy as a whole, any more than the knowledge of a family is a model for the economy of whole. This is probably why people get in trouble, economically speaking, because we think of the nation as a family. And it's not a family. In a family, we know each other, and we have responsibilities for each other. But in a nation, we don't know each other. And precisely because we don't have that knowledge, we have to have a means by which we can acquire that knowledge. And that is, I'm sorry to say it, doesn't sound very romantic or very poetic. It's the free pricing system. That's what gives us the knowledge. And it doesn't matter who you are, whether I like you or not, or what your race is, or your gender is, or all the rest of it. We trade. And this applies not just domestically, but it applies internationally as well. Because when goods cross borders, armies tend not to. So I think this is the kind of thing. So no, I don't think in the Acts of the Apostles shows, despite what Mark said, that we have a model for socialism.
Okay, so we'll do, we should have one more question over here. Yeah. And as we transition over here, as an economics professor, I think the description of the price system is very romantic. So,
Of course you will. Put it into onomatopoeia.
I'll be back.
I'm going to talk too much. Your father, I think you lost your calling. I think you should be at the pulpit.
I am.
I'm
I'm a full-time
glad to
pastor.
hear that. Because
You actually say back
I
over
would
here.
enjoy hearing you. But even though we're in complete disagreement, I know you've been answering this, that you'll tell me that Jesus Christ was not a socialist, where I tell you, I feel he's a socialist. But let's go to a hospital. A hospital can not deny anybody that goes through the emergency room. Who's going to pay for that? I mean, the alternative to the American, if you have no health insurance and you run up a big bill, you're going to have to declare bankruptcy. Right? That's what, so how are we going to solve these problems? I mean, these problems need addressed. Where I think we're utilities capitalists, because I mean, you said the word about the stewardship of the earth that we're supposed to have a price. I don't think the people at the top are following that.
Okay.
I think it's just make money. I mean, that's capitalism. The whole purpose of a corporation is to make money. I mean, which I don't dispute, but my problem is our taxes since the 1960s are not correct.
Well, let me start with.
Sorry about it. I mean,
No.
I'm being enraged. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. I'm Italian from Brooklyn, New York. You sound like.
Well, I'm Irish. I'm Irish.
You sound like a family dinner. I mean, this wine. No, again, this is what I was saying earlier. It's not disagreement. Don't be afraid of disagreement, even passionate disagreement. Just let's keep it rational, right? So the first thing you said was you disagreed. I said Jesus. You presume that I would say Jesus wasn't socialist. You presume correctly, and you said that you think Jesus was.
Correct.
So what is socialism? Is socialism just kind of getting together and being one with each other and caring for each other?
Well, that's really where I see it.
Is it the Acts of
That's
the
where I see-
Apostles?
That's where I see it.
Is it the Acts of the Apostles? Is it the family? That's not what I call socialism. The distinction between that and socialism is that socialism uses force to achieve this. And I'm not saying that these values.
Isn't everything a government force? It's some level. You've got to pay
Yes,
taxes.
which is why we need